So we're now approaching the period of the Restoration, which is the restoration of the monarchy. We've had what's called the interregnum period when Oliver Cromwell has been ruling, and he has, in his ruling, failed to account for a successor. The military machine that he had was so powerful that it ran for 6 months after he died, but then collapsed. And what we have is a man by the name of George Monk, who is a leader of the Army of Scotland, who was Cromwell's Major General, but a royalist at heart. On January the 1st, 1660, invaded England. Nobody wanted to resist him, and he took London by February the 3rd. He assembled Parliament on April the 25th, 1660, in addition to the House of Lords, and issued what's called the Declaration of Breda, which was an invitation to Charles II to return, and Charles returned on the 26th of May. So it's important to note that while we've had this experiment in politics, what hasn't happened is a wholesale change. England could have become a republic and certainly had the wherewithal to do it, but it never really persuaded the royalists over to their position. Plus, I don't think, and this is really a problem of Oliver Cromwell, Oliver Cromwell could never present enough of a succession chain to persuade people to adopt some sort of republican position. So it's really his fault in many ways. But the world of which we have turned to has now changed quite significantly. England is now a serious contender in Europe. Not that it was particularly minor before, but it has, I think historically, being an island stuck off the coast of France, but also being a Protestant nation separate from the rest of the Catholic kingdoms in Europe, has always made it some sort of outlier. But when we get to England, England is now really looking for some sort of status quo, an urge to a return to status quo. Parliament, in doing this, overrid any actual ordinance after 1641. So for the last 19 years or so, all those acts were removed, and the military were returned to be under the king instead of in this, to the New Model Army. However, power has shifted, and this is something very important to note, that things have changed. And while there is no complete reversal of what has happened before, there is now much more of a power sharing balance than hitherto in English history. And while we won't quite reach the heady heights of William of Orange later on, we are absolutely on the way there. So Parliament has advanced its power to the Triennial Act, which is where they will meet for 3 times a year. The whole idea of Puritanism collapses. There is a good question, I think this is there's a treatment of this, by an English historian called Christopher Hill, who questions whether or not any of this was actually cohesive in the first place. And when we talk about Puritanism, what is it do we actually mean? That's a whole sort of class on its own. But we have a number of acts introduced. The Corporation Act of 1661, which is a security measure where all government officials have to swear allegiance and supremacy, much like the oaths of Henry VIII and his ones. And you also had to swear an oath of non-resistance against the king. This is followed by the Uniformity Act of 1662, where all clergy have to take the aforementioned Corporation Act oaths, and everybody has to accept the Book of Common Prayer and 39 Articles. In 1664, the first of the Conventicles Acts is passed, which comprised of legal measures which were to suppress dissenting congregations. And also things like the 5 Mile Act, which meant that you couldn't sort of preach within 5 miles of certain areas. In a way, these are both intolerant and tolerant. They are a form of toleration in a negative form. You could worship however you wanted in your own home. You could preach outside of the towns and away from your parish. That's the 5 Mile Act. So you could have these things. It was just a lot more complicated than maybe before. The Church of England certainly had or has a number of different problems. The world outside has changed. And again, this is a whole nother class on its own, but the Puritans have left behind certain legacies which will fundamentally affect, I suppose, both England and eventually the world. There is absolutely an increase in the scientific spirit, a rationalistic approach towards the world. There is a sense of general rational inquiry. And again, it kind of goes back to this idea that because God is a rational being, the world he has created is a rational place. And so therefore you can investigate it with rational means. And so we have a couple of things. Francis Bacon's Novum Organum, which he published in 1620, where the state encourages technology and science, and there is a big push towards reform and education. These are kind of, I suppose, in a way, prototype Enlightenment values, but they're all the way back here. Divorce is seriously discussed as the first time. John Milton had a very unhappy marriage and raised a lot of talk about this. There's the introduction of civil marriage in 1653. See, for the Puritan stood alone against God. In other words, in previous Christian religions, you are part of a community and you stand before God. For Puritans, you stood alone against God. It was you and your soul, and you had to sort of decide what you were going to do with it in front of God. And also, because you're alone against God, you're also alone against the universe. And there are a couple of things that pop out of this. Firstly, what we have is the Royal Society. The Royal Society is a group of people who get together for, quote, improving natural knowledge. It's kind of like the Charles II. And from this group of people comes all sorts of, I suppose, fundamental parts of our scientific knowledge about a number of things. So William Harvey, for example, discovers, and I'll put this quote unquote, discovers the circulation of the blood around the body and the fundamentals of reproduction. Robert Boyle, and of you who do chemistry will know about Boyle's law, the father of chemistry and physics. John Newton, who investigates optics, astronomy, and physics, writing his sort of magnum opus, the Principia Mathematica, in 1686. John Locke, this is more philosophical, but writes an essay concerning human understanding. And these are all like massive pieces of work. This is followed by Thomas Hobbes, who writes Leviathan, which is a theory of life and politics. And these rationalistic approaches to the world, to the universe, while perhaps religious in origin, there are a number of Christian historians you can read about this. But what they begin to do is that they begin to separate their thinking from the Bible, and thus begins, I suppose, a series of attacks upon the church and the collapse of hierarchical religion. And by the time we get to the late 1600s and definitely into the full Enlightenment period, this will be very, very obvious. So the Church of England, while in theory now has complete state support and all these people swearing allegiances and whatnot, the world outside of it is going to be presenting different challenges which it may or may not meet. So power has shifted in the Church of England. There is an economic change in power. The landed classes had survived the interregnum period despite some high taxation. And some royalist lands had been taken away, and now some of them had been returned. But a massive debt has been created over the last 100 years. We can't blame the interregnum for this. We can blame all sorts of different things, as I've talked about in previous lectures. So high taxation returns. There's a sharp fall in agricultural prices generally at the end of the 17th century. And so many people just simply went out of businesses. And it's the larger estates which were more economical to manage. They have more capital to pay tax, and they also can make improvements. And we are heading into the period of the agricultural revolution. While we're not going to quite hit the industrial revolution in this period, we are absolutely beginning to see some sort of changes here and there. And in this economic shift, as we talked about the landed classes, there is, quote unquote, the decline of the gentry, which isn't quite true. It's been suggested by a number of historians. But there are increasing careerists in the House of Commons, people who are peerage but have been raised to that peerage status, and this leads to a wealthy career aristocracy. And Britain, as I said, is finding itself to be more of a power in Europe. We have moved to the sea. Land battles and fighting on land is not so much of the name of the game. Now it's going overseas and doing things. And so, for example, in England, we have the Navigation and Staple Acts. This is 1660 and 1663, which all ships must be routed through England on English ships, which allows you, of course, to tax people. And so this meant that any foreigners wanting to trade had to go through England, which increases their costs. And the Navy is a sort of a major industry now. There's a rise in population in the UK, which gives us a surplus of people to cruise ships. We are on the forefront of technological progress, and wars are fought on the basis to increase trade, and more trade leads to more wars. And so this is a self-perpetuating cycle. So we end up people battling on the seas. And it's not necessarily between warships, but it's between merchants and warships. And this is how the English managed to exploit the Dutch, which ended up in the Dutch Wars. And so the Dutch began to lose overseas holdings. In Brazil, they lost New York to the English, they lost the fisheries in Newfoundland, and they lost the spice trade. The spice trade also came at the time when people began to grow better food and be able to keep their cattle over winter. Before, what would happen, winter would come along, and so your cattle would die off because you didn't have enough food to feed them, so you'd kill them and keep maybe a couple of pigs and a cow or a sheep or something. And so then the next year you could start all over again. And the spices were sort of used to keep meat from going, or at least smelling bad. And that's why the spice trade was so incredibly important. But as people began to figure out how to keep their animals alive, spices become less important. And so the spice trade begins to collapse as well. I won't say collapse, sorry, that's not quite true. The spice trade becomes less important at this point. Now, for all his faults, Cromwell had cleared the Western Mediterranean, which gave the Levant Company, this is the time of corporations, corporations begin to appear in the UK. The Levant Company, which is one of these companies, had an important luxury trade with the Middle East and Central Asia. In America, we have the plantations there, which begin to return dividends in the Virginias, the Carolinas, and Jamaica. And we have an increase in returns of rice and tobacco and sugar into Europe via England. The East India Company, which is one of the other major companies, lost the spice trade, but then gained the lucrative cotton trade from India. And as time goes on, England and many of the other countries too will cease poking around in Europe, and they will go overseas to other places to get their money. Now, over all of this, of course, all these changes in power is Charles II, who is much more of a leader for all the people than all of his predecessors. He has enthusiastic support from all quarters. He has no visible enemies or critics. And he issues what's called the Act of Oblivion, which restricts recriminations against people who had been supportive of Oliver Cromwell, except the ones who had signed his father's death warrant. So those who were guilty of regicide were exempt from this, and I think were executed. And yet, despite all of this support, he squandered all of this with a lack of concentration. He had too many interests and the usual Stuart failings. He had no understanding of money. He spent way too much money. He had no long-term policy. He was a poor strategist. He was a bad public seater, and he competently dealt with Parliament. So none of this is particularly great for him, but at least he has a good start. Now, of course, when it comes to politics, the Restoration had sort of relieved the English people of the last 20 years. And so many things that have been banned by the Puritans, we have this sort of idea of Puritans being sort of banning all sorts of fun stuff. And that was partially true. And people began to whip out their maypoles and drink again. And the monarch was sort of toasted, and everybody seemed to be fairly happy. And I think maybe this sort of explains a little bit why there was such a return to a monarchy in England. People had a hard time deciding, or at least justifying, the legitimacy of Cromwell's government. And what the royalists did was to align themselves with the case of legitimacy. And so that the Restoration stands for things like the common law and for the historic institutions of the country, including Parliament. And this is for good order. And so they've created a sort of, if you like, a certain amount of propaganda about the legality of who they were versus Cromwell. And this isn't an accident. This was done by Charles II himself, but also a constitutionalist, a conservative constitutionalist called Edward Hyde, who had opposed Charles I because he thought the king had broken up a tradition. And then he had fought for the king in the civil wars because he believed the opposite was true about Parliament. And so he set about trying to restore what he perceived to be traditional government, not just the monarchy, but also this. Now, there is no need or requirement to aim for a new constitution. There's no need to write a new constitution because in theory, and this is sort of a bit of a fudge, but nothing that had taken place during the civil wars had been legal anyway. And so they just ignored 20 years of history and anything that Parliament had been doing and just sort of skipped over it. So there was no need to change anything that we'd had before. Charles II had been king since his father's death. And so none of the acts of Parliament could be considered as having any force whatsoever. So in the eyes of the law, as some historians have put it, the Restoration simply means the restoration of restoration means the termination of illegalities rather than the setting up of something new. Unfortunately, this is a problem because it's one thing to have theory on one hand, but you've got to match it up with reality on the other. And so many things have actually changed with the events of the civil wars and the interregnum that you can't just simply turn the time back to 1642 and hope that everything is exactly the same as before. However, this is what many people around and including Edward Hyde thought could happen. And so this is what they want to try to do. It's sort of complicated for them. And they come across a number of different problems. The Restoration is bipartisan in nature. It's a good way, rather in a good way. You've got the Presbyterians and Anglicans on the same side, which is a good thing. It's very, very important. But it means that there's a contradiction from the very beginning of the Restoration, because the two sides are essentially incompatible. You can't have bishops, and you can't have a church that believes in bishops and a church that doesn't believe in bishops. They kind of are going to run into trouble with each other. And what we have is, and this is an important point to note, that this tension between these two sides ultimately results in the creation of two different political parties, the Tories and the Whigs. And in a way, this really is a continuation of the differences between royalists and parliamentarians that we had during the Civil War. But at least now we're all doing it under a monarchical framework. Nobody wanted to relive those sort of 10, 20 years of disruptive English, those 20 years that had disrupted so much of English society. And so we have two sides with opposing views of what the sovereign should be doing and how the sovereign should be working. So the Tories support the Stuarts, and they believe that they should be relatively free to act. And the Whigs believe the monarchy should be more circumscribed and that the House of Commons should have much greater power. And even to this day, in effect, the Tory party in England, the Conservatives, they're known as the Tories, they still believe that, they still generally tend to be people who support the monarchy and while we can't draw a direct line between the Whigs and any of the modern parties now, the opposition to them are the parties that believe, or at least used to believe up until Tony Blair in the late 1990s, they believed that the power should generally rest in the hands of the people. So the Tories tend to be very conservative and Anglican in their religion, and the Whigs kind of tend to sort of sit on the other side, a range of different religions, a range of different Christianities, so to speak, different denominationals. Now we do have, so that's the politics of the situation. We also have to deal with the religious side of things. The question of religion is still very important, and still will be for probably another 60, 80 years. Charles II is, firstly, very sympathetic to Catholicism. We have a problem in that we have a large number of new Protestant sects. Puritans, kind of the idea of a Puritan or a group of Puritans dissipates and turns into sort of a non-conformity. So in other words, if you're not an Anglican, you're a non-conformist, and that could be a wide variety of people. It doesn't have to just be one type of alternative Protestantism. It could be quite a number, and there were quite a number, and your textbooks will talk about some of this. Now, Charles had promised not to persecute anybody, but the leaders of the Tories were determined to put an end to many of the sects, because many of them were actually socially revolutionary as well. And they offered or suggested certain things that in some ways are quite egalitarian in today's thinking, but back then would have been seen as an awful horror. And so the Tories are trying to get rid of these, and they want to exact revenge on the Presbyterians for all this kind of behavior. So what we have is a number of acts, the Clarendon Code of 1661, which said that only those who swore to uphold the Church of England in episcopal form could be priests, or could hold government office. So if you're not an Anglican, you're not going to get into government. And this didn't actually last for very long, but it made life difficult for free thinkers. But what we begin to see is a secularizing tendency, because people dislike the idea of persecution, persecution of children as well. So we are beginning to see how people are going to be turning away from religion to being the defining question of the day. We're not there yet, but this is the beginning of the moving of it. So society becomes much more conformist and much less concerned with a real belief. In other words, it doesn't really matter, much like Elizabeth I, I guess, it doesn't really matter what you do on the outside, as long as it looks like everybody else. What you do on the inside is up to you. What you think inside your heart, that's up to you. So in many ways, the Church of England becomes a social mechanism for maintaining order rather than saving souls. And of course, that has always been the case of most institutional or state churches. They stop being committed to the issue of the gospel, and they end up really just becoming an extension of the government in some ways. So Charles is very supportive of Catholicism, but Parliament is not. And it's very antagonistic to the question of Catholic succession. And at this time, we have formation of parties widely recognized. So we have the Tories, who are supporters of the Jacobite succession of James, and the Whigs are supporters of Protestantism. And this is what we'll see with this. So that's the Restoration. And it is kind of going okay. But in February 1685, the king is incapacitated by a stroke, and he dies after a short illness. And it was on his deathbed that he found the moment that he'd been waiting for, which was to convert to Catholicism. Now, actually, he had no children by his own wife, but he did have 12 by all of his mistresses. Unfortunately, that doesn't quite qualify any of them to be king, and so James II, which is Charles II's brother, steps into the place of being a king. So we talk about the Glorious Revolution. This is Glorious Revolution of 1685 to 1688. And it's quite unique as a revolution. There's no particular economic reason for it. There's no particular social reason for it. And it almost is completely about the king and his relationship with the upper classes. So we'll talk a little bit about how the downfall begins. It all starts with the Duke of Monmouth, who attempts a rebellion and an attack on the throne. He is supported by Republican elements. He's caught, he's executed, and his followers are destroyed by Judge Jeffreys in what's called the Bloody Assizes. And if any of you come next year, we'll probably go visit one of the places where Judge Jeffreys sort of killed lots of people. He executed a lot. But to do all of this, to suppress the Duke of Monmouth, James had to rely on 2 English regiments from the Dutch army. That doesn't really betray a lot of support for him. And James is noted really for his conflict. He has quite a number of conflicts. He has a conflict with his wife. James is very lusty. At the coronation of George I in 1714, the Countess of Dorchester, who is the mistress of James II, encounters the Duchess of Portsmouth, who is mistress of Charles II, and the Countess of Orkney, the mistress of William III, at the coronation of George I. And she says, "Good God, who would have thought that we 3 whores should have met here?" So James, like many other monarchs, has quite a number of mistresses poking around. And one of his main ones is Catherine Sedley, who is a Protestant. Samuel Pepys, who is most famous for writing a very long diary full of all sorts of salacious details and gossip, said that she had none of the most virtuous, but a wit. And she was only 21 when James chose her to be a mistress, and she was quite surprised, probably like everybody else, because according to contemporary sources, she was tall, extremely thin, quite plain, and as she got older, she became almost emaciated, and she had a squint. And the standard of beauty at the time was plump, with rosy cheeks and golden curls. Charles II used to refer to Louise Keroualle, the Duchess of Portsmouth, affectionately as Fubbs. Catherine remarked, "We are none of us handsome, and if we have wit, he hasn't enough of it to discover it." So James can't keep it in his pants, and he has a relationship with Catherine Sedley. She's ejected by the Queen, and in other words, he's not very good at managing conflict or keeping things under wraps. But he's also in conflict with the nobility, and as I said, this is really an argument mostly about the upper classes. As I said, James has trouble putting down his rebellion, and he needs to bolster his army. So he recruits 90 Catholic officers. And he does this, and when they come in, they do not have to take the Test Act, which is required, which requires you to be a member of the Church of England for public employment. And the House of Commons is very much against this, and they're bullied into submission. And the House of Lords is really against this, largely because I think the House of Lords is full of bishops. But Henry Compton, the Bishop of London, is dismissed from the Privy Council for his opposition. And James claims that he has prerogative dispensation for this. And this starts the hardening of James's attitude. And originally, Parliament was generous to him. They were willing to work with him, despite his Roman Catholicism, and Parliament was quite generous. But he then begins, I suppose, the propagation of the Roman faith. He encourages priests to return from abroad. He allows a Jesuit school to be established in London. A Catholic press is set up, which floods the market with cheap literature. He resumes diplomatic correspondence with the Vatican. Envoys are exchanged with the Vatican, and requests for bishops to be appointed. And yet, conversion rates are actually very low throughout the reign. The relations with Innocent XI were very poor, the Pope at the time. And to be honest, most English Protestants just wanted to get on, English Catholics wanted to get on with their Protestant majority neighbours. And James is unnecessarily stirring up a hornet's nest because of this. And he stirs up this hornet's nest, and he makes it worse by including Catholics in the Privy Council, a Jesuit confessor in the cabinet. He re-Catholicizes Ireland, and 250 Catholics replace justices of the peace. And remember that justices of the peace have to swear the Test Act, which means they have to swear allegiance to the Church of England. And now he's replacing the legal parts with Catholics. And he issues the Declaration of Indulgence, which suspends penal laws against Roman Catholics and also dissenters. So in a way, that at least from a, I suppose, a liberal perspective, this is actually a good thing, because nobody is being suppressed in how they wish to do their religion. But the final nails in James's coffin is really the issue of an heir. And you can think back to Henry VIII and his problems. The same issues are still going on in the Stuarts, 100 years later. By 1687, James was 55 and he has no male heir. His daughter, Mary, is married to William of Orange, and she's a Protestant. And the hope is that James II will die without an heir, and then a Protestant will inherit the throne, and then we won't have this problem with all these fiddlesome Catholics. And then Queen Mary suddenly becomes pregnant in 1687. And if the baby's male, then we have a Catholic heir, and then that's it. And I talked about the Declaration of Indulgences, these where James wishes to suspend penal laws against Catholics and dissenters. And he requires the churches in 1688, he requires the churches to read this in church. And 7 Church of England bishops, including the Archbishop, petitions against this, and he tries them for sedition. And the question is really about the legality of the dispensing power by the king. Can the king force you to do things like this? And the answer is no, and they were all acquitted to great joy. And then in June 1688, Mary gives birth to Prince James, James III. And immediately rumors begin that it actually wasn't hers, that he, later on, there were rumors that he was smuggled into a bedpan. They just grabbed a random baby, whacked it into a bedpan, which are kind of like big dishes that you stick full of coals inside your bed. It's like a hot water bottle in the olden days. This semester, I think, if you come to us with, and go to us with, I can speak English now. If you come with us to the Hampton Court, you'll see, I think, a bedpan in one of the bedrooms there. So you can sort of see how a baby could be kind of squished inside one and smuggled in. But this production of an heir leads 7 cross-party politicians to do about this, and they're called the Immortal Seven. And in June 1688, the Immortal Seven send a letter to William of Orange asking him to intervene to secure a free parliament and to investigate the suspicious birth of James III. Now, William actually had been anticipating a possible invasion of England if James II had sided with Louis against him. Sorry, this is the French King Louis, Louis XIV. But Louis was willing to support James, and Louis had moved his troops south to invade the Palatinate in Germany. And this actually frees William of Orange. And so in October 1688, he declares he's coming over, quote, to preserve and maintain the established laws, liberties, and customs of England, and also to investigate the issue of whether the birth of the prince is actually legitimate or not. And on the 1st of November, he set sail, and he's carried across the channel by what's known later as the Protestant wind, which was a wind blowing unusually in the right direction for his purposes. And he's carried down across the channel, and he lands in the west of England on the 5th of November, 1688, which is a very propitious day indeed, because that's the day when Guy Fawkes had attempted to blow up Parliament, and he was denied that, as they called him. And it's a celebration which we have in England, and we celebrate it every November the 5th. And of course, landing on this day looks good. So now we have a problem of James versus William. Now this is the battle. And so James joins his army in Salisbury, but then loses his nerve and retreats to London. And several army leaders defect to William of Orange. There are some uprisings in some of the cities against James. And so James decides he needs to escape. And so he sends his family to safety and attempts to flee on the 11th of December. And in the process, he takes the Great Seal of England with him, which is what you use to stamp all your documents, and sort of is like how government works. You've got to have the seal. And he throws it into the River Thames in an effort to paralyze the government. But he's captured by a fishing boat on his way out of England, and he's returned to London, where he's held in custody until the 20th of December, where he escapes again, probably in collusion with some of William's supporters who allowed him to escape. And in some ways, it's probably a good thing. As one historian has suggested, what would have happened if James had stayed? They would have been back in the position of 1648 negotiations with Charles I. But with James gone, the political process could just proceed in his absence. So he's allowed to escape to France, and then the nobility just tell William of Orange and Mary, Protestants, take up the reins of government. And so this ultimately was going to change how England functioned from here on. And let's sort of talk a little bit about why is it that it is a glorious revolution? Well, it may seem a little strange. We still have a king and we still have a parliament. So what's the difference? And what's changed? And I suppose you could say that the revolution was different, or it is in two ways, both a Whig and a Tory revolution. I mean, it's a political coup d'etat by the elites, right? But it's also in part a country revolution. It's not just a town, it's also country. And it merged a range of political opinion in opposition to James. And they have this spectre of popery and arbitrary power in their minds. And the political settlement, as it emerged, reflects the composite nature of this revolution. So in January 1689, a convention parliament begins to work out what they're going to do now. So we've got about 320 people who are of the Whig parties and about 230 broadly Tory supporters. And they have a number of debates about what actually is going to go on. And they resolved, they sort of have this whole sort of debate and argument and sort of backwards and forwards, and they resolve, and I'll quote this, that King James II, having attempted to subvert the constitution of the kingdom by breaking the contract between king and people and by the advice of Jesuits and other wicked persons, having violated the fundamental laws and having withdrawn himself out of this kingdom, has abdicated the government, and that the throne is thereby vacant. Now, if you remember a couple of lectures ago, we talked about the phrasing of the Book of Common Prayer when it comes to what happens when you hold up the bread of Christ, or the body. Is it bread? Is it actually Christ's body? And the way the Book of Common Prayer phrases this allows you a certain amount of ambiguity in it to sort of read what you want in it. So they say that James broke the contract between king and people. And remember, that's kind of a Whig idea, right? That the king is in power in a contract with the people. But he also withdrew himself. He also abdicates. So he actually hasn't been gotten rid of. Nobody's kicked him out. Nobody's killed him like Charles I. Nobody's done anything wrong. He's left by himself. And so this kind of assuages the Tories' part. Remember, they're big monarchical supporters. You're not allowed to resist a king as a Tory, or the Tories thought he shouldn't. And so he's abdicated. And then nobody really likes the Jesuits, on either side. So that kind of deals with that. They completely ignored the question of James III, the baby. And so this is what we end up with. We end up with a king who is, well, actually, he shares the king. William and Mary both share the crown together until her death in 1694. And he is a king, in fact, but he wasn't an elected king. He legitimately holds the throne because of his wife. And they also agreed that Mary's youngest sister, Princess Anne would be the next heir ahead of any other children that William and Mary might have themselves. This is all very, very strange and very, very odd kind of thinking. And so the convention also draws up a Declaration of Rights. So Americans take note here, which later passes into law as the Bill of Rights. Americans take note. It was clear on some matters which found universal assent, but it was also cautious and ambiguous in others. The powers of the monarch to suspend laws was declared to be illegal, but the dispensing power of the monarch, the traditional dispensing power, was illegal, quote, only as it has been exercised of late. In other words, only as it's been used by James II. Parliaments should be called frequently and should be freely elected, but there was no specific measures to ensure how that would happen. Roman Catholics were excluded from the crown. That is actually a position that has been maintained all the way up until, I think, maybe the last 10 years, maybe 15, but definitely the last 15 years. You couldn't be a Roman Catholic and ascend the throne in England. So Roman Catholics are excluded from the throne. And in a way, it looked a bit like a contract with the new monarchs. But the offer of the crown to William and Mary was not made conditional upon accepting it. The offer of the crown was actually made on 13th of February, before the Declaration of Rights had been presented to William and Mary, and they hadn't formally accepted it before they were proclaimed monarchs the next day. So what we see in 1689 is a series of measures of transferring power to William and Mary via Parliament. So they voted something, for example, like the Mutiny Act. So the Mutiny Act is that no standing army would be permitted in peacetime unless if it was authorized by Parliament. I remember that the army was sort of separate from Parliament during the Civil War, or at least during Oliver Cromwell's reign. So in a way, they are kind of keeping the army away from Parliament, but being authorized by Parliament at the same time. So we don't have a standing army. And that's actually maybe a step backwards, because a standing army is always quite useful, but it also means that a standing army can't be used against anybody. If you dislike something, Parliament can't arbitrarily send an army off to go and do something. So they also voted income to the crown by taxation. It wasn't enough. It was completely inadequate, but it was there anyway. They passed a Toleration Act, which allowed Protestant dissenters, in other words, people who were not members of the Church of England, to worship publicly. The Church of England is still the state church, and the Test Act is still there to exclude members from holding public office. But Protestant dissenters were allowed to worship openly. If you were a Jew, if you were a Roman Catholic or a Unitarian, you could worship in private, and you were tolerated officially. So the settlements of 1688 and 9 are kind of a very pragmatic group of documents and ideas, which are designed really to appeal to as many people as possible and to alienate as few people as possible. John Morrill, who is one of the historians of this time period, has said that this is a centrist compromise and a constitutional blur. And so much like the Elizabethan religious settlement in 1559, it's full of inconsistencies. And, these will be worked out, but there will be arguments about, what does this actually mean? So what are the changes? Well, after 1688, the situation was transformed in less than 10 years, mostly in the face of the need to raise money. We've talked about money always being the major issue of the Stuarts, and nothing has changed. The government has been racking up debts, and this was the problem. Parliament was now in control, not only of the grant of supply, but also the expenditures, right? And so annual estimates were submitted and Parliament would vote on these and sort of say, And so there's a whole audit here of what's happening to money. So rather than just dumping money into the monarch and the monarch gets to decide what's happening to it, the Parliament now gets to audit this and sort of make sure it's going, it's sort of being done properly. And this is, I believe, still the case today in many cases. Although we've had a couple of revelations recently that show that the monarchy in England has been doing some naughty things, but we won't talk about that just now. Anyway, so Parliament is sanctions a whole series of devices to raise money for the war with the French. England and France have always had long-standing, complicated relations, and we are no different at this period as well. And so we begin to tax. We vote a land tax in, which is a tax on landowners, and it brings in a reliable annual income. Now, remember, up until this point, taxes are only sort of generally on an ad hoc basis. If you need something, you have a tax, and you don't sort of just have a general tax for the, an income tax like we do now. It was only on an ad hoc basis. If you needed it, you called it. Otherwise, you didn't do it. Now they're doing it on a more regular annual basis. They tried out lotteries to see what would happen, which raised money and worked to a degree. But most importantly, perhaps in 1694, the Bank of England is chartered, and lenders were brought to subscribe to a £1.2 million loan, with the interest and repayment of this capital coming back from taxation. Now, it's not a central bank in the modern sense that we have nowadays, but it's a vehicle which is devised to raise money for the state. And if the state needs money, you do it through the Bank of England. So these are the development of well, there is also a development of a market in various forms of state securities being issued. And they could be sold on to third parties. And this was at the core of the emergence of dealings in stock and the beginnings of the London Stock Exchange, which is one of the largest stock exchanges, I think, still in the world. Now, this is all improvised. It's all on an ad hoc basis, but it's turning out into some sort of coherent system eventually of gaining money, of how a parliament and how a monarch will essentially sort of pay for itself. Where will they get it from? So initially, the land tax, which was the first tax, was very heavy, which hits you with about a 20% tax on landed income in the richest counties. And probably by about 1700, about 9% of national income was being taken in taxation. And the same year, about the third of the revenue raised by the state was using to fund the debts. So what we have is, after 1688, the fiscal capacity of the state is rapidly and massively transformed. Military expenditure was about, military expenditure as part of the national income is about 2% by the death of Charles in 1685, but by 1700 it was at 4%. At the height of the Spanish War, 10 years later in 1710, it was 14%, and then afterwards sort of came down to about 5%. And this mostly is about maintaining the Royal Navy. And so this now is a constant and repeated exercise, which is very useful. So Parliament guarantees money, and that's good, but it comes at a price. There's a political price to this. The general suspicion of central government amongst parliamentarians meant that they exerted themselves to try to shape this emerging state apparatus in ways which would accord with their own preferences, their suspicion of central government, right? The need for annual parliamentary supply means that Parliament really needs to become a permanent part of the government of the country. And of course, they're against that kind of thing. They need to have a parliamentary session every single year. Nobody sort of anticipated this, but now they've created a structure which they didn't really want. So maybe in American terms, you're a small government person, but you've created such a monster in the state that the state needs constant attending, and so you can't have small government. You've got to have large government because you've just created something that's too big to handle on a small level. And so they kind of, this is one of the many problems. Sometimes they would tack on to revenue bills what's called a Place Act, and this is an act which attempts to exclude government officials from the House of Commons. And this is the idea that we need to sort of keep Parliament separate from the other sections of government. In 1694, William is forced to accept a Triennial Act. Now, remember, this has been the plea all the way back from Charles I. We've got to have a Parliament. We've got to be to Parliament every at least 3 years. And so they have a new Triennial Act, which is where Parliament should not only be called every 3 years, but should not sit longer than 3 years without new elections. So you now have to have elections every 3 years. And this is a very significant curtailment of the royal prerogative. Remember, kings always called these parliaments. That was their royal prerogative. But now what we're doing is enshrining this idea somewhere else. William actually resisted it, but he had to give way in the end. And so by about 1700, the relationship between the ministers and the royal government, those who sat in cabinet, and Parliament had become the crucial axis of political life. So no longer is the king the primary thing. He's very important. He's still there, and please don't come away thinking that the king is not important. But we now have we now have Parliament, which is much more important and is at the center of government, which had never been like this before. And so we end up then with a very vigorous branch of party politics in Parliament, the Whigs and the Tories, largely speaking. And they tended to disagree on many things. The one thing where they did come together was to do with Queen Anne's, the death of Queen Anne. If you remember, William and Mary, their own children were not allowed to succeed the throne. It had to go to Princess Anne. The death of Princess Anne's only child, the ultimate heir to the throne, called into question the future succession of the crown. And so this precipitates something called the Act of Settlement of 1701, which both Whigs and Tories supported. Now, remember that Tories are very big royalists. The Whigs are, they're not anti-royalists necessarily, but they have that sort of background of being less enthusiastic about the king. Both of them agree that when it comes to the succession of the throne, there was a whole list of people who were closer in line, whether they were all Roman Catholic, and they skipped over all of these Roman Catholics, and they came down to the succession on the Electress, Sophia of Hanover, who was a ruler of a small North German principality who was actually descended from James I. And this woman and her heirs are chosen as the nearest Protestant successors. The Act of Settlement also required that future monarchs should be communicants of the Church of England. In other words, you have to go to church and take communion in the Church of England. You weren't allowed to marry Catholics, so that put a hole in that problem. It restricted the movements of monarchs outside of the kingdom, so you couldn't leave the kingdom without permission. And it made privy councillors, the people who talked to the king and who were sort of like the king's government, at least during Henry VIII's day, they were now much more accountable to Parliament. So in 1701, when the Act of Settlement was passed, which fixed the succession of these people to the Hanoverian line, the Scottish Parliament did not actually follow England's lead in recognizing the Hanoverian succession. And this raised a problem in the 18th century, a fairly large problem. What would happen if the Scottish Parliament decided to recognize a Stuart succession after Queen Anne's death? So we've got the English Parliament who are going this way, but they haven't quite sorted out what they're going to do with the Scottish Parliaments, who in theory could go that way. And so if there is any alliance between the Royalists in Scotland and sort of, say, other people, there's going to be a big problem when it comes to who's going to be, will the kingdoms still be united together, or will the two kingdoms separate, go each way? And so the English government then began to put pressure on for a union, which was to remove this problem that the Scots might go another way. And they were willing to use economic leverage to do it. And so in 1705, the English Parliament passed the Alien Acts, which excluded Scots from English markets unless if they were willing to sort of begin negotiating about a possible union. And there was a lot of economic advantage for Scotland if they should do so. It's interesting now that we have a reversal of this. Scotland wishes to become, or at least some Scottish people wish to become independent of England. And there are all sorts of economic reasons as to why that is. But at least back here, when they were joined, there were good economic reasons to joining. Now, Scotland sort of ended up talking about this, and they had a big discussion about it, and eventually they agreed on it. And so we have, in 1707, the Treaty of Union was agreed. So now there would be a single united Kingdom of Great Britain with a single flag, the Union Jack. And while it is absolutely true, if you look at the English flag and then you look at the individual kingdoms' flags, you will have the Kingdom of England and you'll have the Kingdom of Scotland, and they all merge together, and that's how we have our modern English flag. Nobody ever thinks of the Welsh. The Welsh don't get a look in, and neither does Northern Ireland. It's kind of interesting. But now, under this, we have a joined United Kingdom. We have a Hanoverian line of succession that's recognized by everybody, and that is a good thing. So what do we end up with at the end of everything? Well, we have a sort of a strange situation. We have a monarchy that's actually run by a parliament, a truly, in a sense, a monarchical republic, after which the king, after 1701, according to at least one historian, actually had fewer powers than were later granted to presidents of the United States. It's a confessional state, and yet a confessional state which has two established religions, the Anglican Church, the Church of England, in England, and the Presbyterian Church in Scotland, which by 1714 was headed by a king who was actually a German Lutheran, but was an Anglican when he was in England and a Presbyterian when he was in Scotland. And meanwhile, practicing greater religious freedom that was tolerated by any other state, save the Netherlands. It was an offshore island deeply hostile to foreign involvement, deeply hostile to militarism, and yet was playing a key role in destroying the threat of Louis XIV's monarchy, and which had emerged as a great military power. And really from this point onwards, the United Kingdom will become a major, absolutely major power in Europe and everywhere else. And this is the beginning of the British Empire, really. And while it starts out small, it will become very big very quickly. But it all goes back to sort of this period. And that is the end of the Glorious Revolution. And that is pretty much the end of the sort of this mini lecture series on this. If you are following in your textbooks, of course, you will sort of have a look at this, and you'll pick up some of the documentation that talks about some of this. It doesn't cover everything, but for me, I think this is a bit more interesting. Right, I will see you all next time, whatever that will be.